Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
In September of this year, Loughborough University student Axel Dopfer broke the German cycling hour record at the end of a year-long journey involving extensive support from a team of academics and practitioners across multiple areas of Loughborough University. I'm Dr. Stuart McCurlane-Naylor, and I'm joined today by Axel himself, as well as Professor Duncan Walker, Dr. Richard Ferguson and Josh Cresswell to discuss what it took to break the record. Hi everyone, welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast and huge congratulations on the record. Okay, so what I thought we'd do to start with is basically go around the virtual table and just give a quick one-liner of just who you are and what was your role within the record. So I think Axel will leave you until the end and then start with everyone else. So I don't know, kind of Richard, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, I'm Richard Ferguson. I'm a reader in human and exercise physiology in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. And I provided the sort of physiological input into the hour record. So working closely with Paddy, Axel's coach, and the rest of the team, of course, into sort of understanding the sort of physiological demands of such an hour record.
If we go for you next then, Duncan, what was your role within the team?
Hi, my name's Duncan Walker. I'm a professor of applied aerodynamics from the Department of Aeronautical and Automotive Engineering. And as you can guess, my role was the aerodynamics guru in this, and I was trying to get Axel to go quicker by cutting through the air more smoothly. But I can't do that without the help of the rest of the team. As you'll see when we talk about it, my role is really to squash Axel into a very small box, but then he can't pedal, so I need the help of the team to stop me from just going off in my own direction.
Brilliant. And then we'll go for Josh, and then over to you, Axel.
That's a perfect and apt introduction from Duncan there, because I was the other side of that flip coin where I was trying to help establish a position that was sustainable. I'm sure we'll come into a bit more detail about that shortly. But yes, my name's Josh Cresswell. I'm lead physiotherapist for cycling triathlon at Loughborough University. And my role was one, to get Axel to there safe and sound. And then secondly, to establish a position that we know, which we modelled against, would help him to achieve the record.
Great. And then Axel, where did you come into this? Obviously, what was the background? So how did the project start for you? Was there a moment where you recall thinking, I could have a crack at this? Or was it a gradual process leading up to that point? And I guess, how did you go from there to really kick-starting this project?
Yeah, so my name's Axel Dopfer. I had the easier job of just pedaling the bike. But I guess it was a lot more than that. I guess everybody in this call and Paddy as well kind of aided and guided and helped me along the way. And I guess I was a little bit of a experiment for everybody over the last year. But it was really fun, just being able to draw on loads of this knowledge. And of course, we knew straight from the beginning that this project wouldn't be possible just by watts alone. Basically, we knew we would have to do the whole package, especially on the aero side, because there's a simple balance you can do with your CDA. And if you don't hit that amount of watts, then you're never going to do it. So we know we had to lower the CDA straight away. Of course, as Josh said, that wouldn't be possible without thinking of all the biomechanical factors. And then, of course, as Rich said, we had to keep the training going as well. So back to the question, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly one place where it all sort of started. But I think in the back of my mind, I kind of was thinking about it already 2 years ago. But I was pretty much afraid to tell anyone because it was quite ambitious. And honestly, I hadn't really ridden a track bike that well before. I was just on a borrowed bike, and I was sort of just not really committing the way I did as soon as I kind of accepted the hour. So for me personally, I think the hour was sort of a way to really make myself train really hard for a couple of years and focus directly on track. So if I had to pinpoint, though, I would say coming up with the idea on a ride, then kind of letting it brew in the background for a little bit, and then kind of finally having the bravery to tell my coach, Paddy, about it. And Paddy, I can't really remember his first reaction, but I mean, he's always been one to push me and motivate me to go for ambitious goals. So I think he sort of said something like, yeah, it's a good idea, but we need to make sure that we're going to tick all the boxes to actually make this happen, because it would just be arrogant to assume we could just rock up and do it. And I think that's a theme throughout the entire project, is how difficult this actually was. Because I think we were sort of on the kind of the mountain of confidence at the beginning, where we thought, yeah, we're going to do it and it's not going to be too difficult. But as the project went on, we sort of began to realize exactly how hard it was going to be.
And this is a record held by Jens Voigt as well, wasn't it? It's like a huge name in cycling as well.
Yeah, so well, Jens can pedal a lot harder than I can, but luckily technology has advanced, and I guess we sort of took a more university approach to the project, which I think we're all very proud of.
Jens broke the world record when he did it and held the German record for 10 years to the day. So it was 10 years to the day when Axel broke it.
That wasn't obviously planned.
A little bit.
When we found out it was a date, it became like we did plan it, but it was lovely to be able to the decade on that record was broken, so it stood for quite a while.
Yeah, of course. I mean, track was never Jens's thing, but super impressive record, especially 10 years ago. And I think we really begun to respect that more and more throughout the days. And I think I had the most respect for it when I actually started on the day. I don't think I was ever more, respective of that record than when I was actually in the start gate, just thinking about the 51.1 Ks that I was going to have to do in the next hour.
Was that because you could see the banner of Jens Voigt's drove above your head?
Exactly.
I think we'll come back to that, what you were feeling at the start and during the event as we go on. I think one thing you mentioned was taking a university approach, as you called it. And obviously you were and still are a Loughborough student. So what was your involvement, I guess, with any of the wider team prior to this? Or even what was your experience like of juggling training and studying throughout all of this as well?
That is two big questions in one. I think I'll try and do the first one first. Originally, my coach was Paddy, or at least we were working very well together. And then through that, obviously, I was working with Josh in the cycling program as well. But to be honest, I didn't have a connection with Rich or Duncan yet. But then slowly, kind of, Paddy started sort of looking for people who might be able to aid the project, because he basically understood, as all great project managers do, that we can't really just go at it alone, and you need to kind of lean on the experts in the field. And I don't think there's very many places in the world that has as many experts as a university, especially not Loughborough University when it comes to sports and cycling. So I think he probably started talking about it with you, Rich, pretty soon after, or at least brought the ideas up. And I think, Duncan, you were always kind of in contact with the cycling program in general, because you obviously love cycling, but never really in a specific project way, at least not with the kind of Loughborough sports side of things. Maybe you guys could.
A really good way of describing how it kicked off, Axel, because I'd always wanted to sort of give back something to the cycling community with my aerodynamics, but it was, how do we do that, and how do we bridge that gap between the sport and the academic world? And it was Paddy who did that, because essentially wanted to sit down and learn about aerodynamics and how he could bring that into his coaching. So every forward-thinking coach wants to make themselves know more, and so we sat down and I took him through some aerodynamics. He probably had to prod himself to wake up a bit when I bored him with the detail. But then that's when he said, "Oh, I've got this athlete, got this chap who's he's got a good engine, put out the watts. It really would be a good idea if we could take him to the hour record." And for me, that was exactly the vehicle I thought would be a great way to get the aerodynamics into the cycling at Loughborough.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out as well is that it's Paddy Harrison we're talking about here, who came to Loughborough as a self-funded PhD student under my supervision in exercise physiology. So his PhD was around, training adaptation, understanding the sort of mechanisms that govern training adaptation. And alongside that, he developed his coaching skills working with the Loughborough Cycling Academy and athletes like Axel. So he was already aware of, the sort of the physiological implications of such an effort, because that's what his PhD is about. So it was very much approaching Duncan first after that initial coffee conversation with Axel to sort of discuss the aerodynamics package that was critical to sort of breaking the record, and then working through Josh to sort of repackage that so that Axel could fit on the bike and actually pedal the bike. And then it was then in an integrated way, working between all three of us, we were able to put the physiological training package, but also the training was critical to the effort. There's no doubt, but there's also the issue around race day preparation. The preparation in the sort of 24, 48, 1 hour prior to the actual event. So there was a huge effort from a physiological perspective that followed on in an integrated way from the aerodynamics.
I would echo that. There was a real level of holistic approach in what we were doing. It wasn't just an integration of experts, but it was more about that blossoming more. And that, I mean, the cliche is that it equaled a greater sum, because it truthfully did. And I'm sure we'll explore that in a little bit more detail later on.
Great. And then if we go back to the bit about students, while all of this was going on, Axel, you're a Loughborough student. Kind of what was that experience like as well? I imagine it must have been tough.
Yeah, I think the thing is I was training obviously before, but then it was just kind of training to race and not with like a super specific goal in mind. But it's a lot easier to do that because you sort of just tick off your training and then you go home and you chill out for a bit and then you start to revise and then you kind of, go to sleep, wake up, uni, then you kind of find your gaps to train and then you kind of have some time to relax, get your food in, and then that just kind of repeats itself over and over again. But I guess the kind of problem is that with the hour, there was so much other stuff to do as well, like so much optimization that we just kind of had to do basically to achieve the record. So like from an aerodynamic standpoint, we were at the wind tunnel loads. We were always kind of going to the track. And the problem with the track is that you don't just show up 10 minutes before your start time. You have to show up an hour before your track time. And then it takes 30 minutes to get there. So at the end of the day, 1 hour of training on the track is like 3 hours of, out of your day, basically. So it's just kind of like finding even more time just to keep ticking the boxes. So obviously balancing that with a master's degree in mechanical engineering was incredibly difficult. But I think it was really accomplished through working really well with Paddy, especially when it came to kind of valuing consistency over hero weeks. It was just sort of like keep ticking the right amount of training off every week, but like keep it very consistent rather than have 1 week where you just do loads of training and then suddenly you've left all this work for next week and then the next week you're doing barely any training. So it's basically just finding the right balance between being very consistent and also just being very realistic with how much time you have and just not getting overwhelmed. Because at the end of the day, you can do loads of training and then just go to a lecture theater, but you're not actually recovering during that time. So you just need to find out like what that optimal balance is, because you need to recover and you cannot recover when you're sort of at work or kind of at university and like doing loads of stuff. So I think finding that right balance is what we really kind of nailed and I think really led to the success of the project. But also, of course, having the support kind of from everyone around me, like my support team was fantastic throughout the whole thing. And it wasn't always easy, as these guys will tell you, even just to kind of whip me into shape or get me onto the bike. It was sort of like we just had to keep going through the kind of troughs of life, I guess.
Were there any memorable experiences early on in terms of, do you remember anything particular about your first time in the lab or first time in the wind tunnel, or kind of as the team started to build and come together, how that all started to take shape?
Don't mention the first hour attempt at Derby. That was a horrible hour for you, wasn't it? The first time you actually went for an hour, just realizing what it actually entailed physically and mentally. That was probably this time last year, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I remember is when Paddy, we did like a VO2 max test. So we did like an LT1, LT2 test, to like kind of finding some thresholds, and then a VO2 max test after that, just to find out where the VO2 max was at. And then he was like, "Oh, I've got a great idea. So what we're going to do is we'll do that. And then you'll have like 10 minutes rest. And then you're going to do 20 minutes all out. And we're going to see how your kind of lactate values change throughout there. Like what can you actually do just to simulate like when you're really tired and really fatigued, how much power can you actually do?" So I remember that day very clearly. I think Paddy does too. I don't think he's ever seen me that annoyed at him. But then, yeah, as Duncan just alluded to, we thought, you know what, I think the best way to figure out how to do an hour is by just going and doing an hour. So we just kind of showed up and we're like, you know what, we're going to just do it today. Because like the spreadsheet kind of, I think Duncan will allude to that a little bit more, hopefully in more detail. But we created kind of like a balance between how much power you need for set speeds. So we sort of figured it out, but we hadn't quite been to the wind tunnel yet. So we didn't have a great idea of where the CDA was. We had a pretty good idea though. And so we were like, all right, we'll just set off at this kind of road power. And like, yeah, you can do that on the track. That carries over, no worries. And yeah, I think I got 30 minutes in and had to peel off and was just like, that is just the hardest thing I have ever done.
And I think that was a really good example, actually, of talking about how the power aspects then linked in with the aerodynamics and then having to train and prepare for that, which I assume then links in with the nutrition and everything else that's going on. Are there any examples that any of you can give around that interdisciplinary aspect of how you actually all learned to work together, or some of those conflicts between different areas?
Definitely in terms of the aerodynamics, we had several trips to the wind tunnel down at Silverstone where we were just optimizing Axel's position. And Axel's a really great athlete to work with because he's a mechanical engineer. He's really into the process behind it. So really wanted to get as aerodynamic as possible. And we got in some quite extreme positions. And I'm going, yeah, this is great. We've got his CDA down. He's going to smash this record. But he couldn't see properly on the track. And he's going, yeah, I can see for that. And he was in such a position. And eventually what we realised that we're going to have to back off on the aerodynamics. And Josh did a really good job of helping get into that position and maintain that. Josh has a really good mantra of stability and sustainability in these positions and really helping him train like that. So although we'd got a superb aerodynamic position, it wasn't sustainable until we got Josh involved. It's a really good example of how I can squash you into a box, but it doesn't work until we get the whole package together.
I think that sounds like a really lovely segue into me sort of elaborating perhaps a little bit more. So when I sort of came into the project, really, I was based on the modelling which Duncan and the rest of the team had put together. We sort of were given a CDA value which we knew if we achieved with a certain power, the project was on, so to speak. The record was live. And we achieved that through those initial changes. But as Duncan alluded to, it was a discussion between Paddy and Axel at that point. There was a discussion around the strategy which they would adopt actually during the race itself. So actually, at that stage, Axel's position was one where he could see the black line beneath him, but he couldn't see anything ahead of him. Now, that's obviously a good example of optimizing aerodynamics, but the risk of that he's not able to see. So we had to go through then a process of learning and bike fitting. Being a bike fitter, I'm definitely the first to sort of proclaim that it is an iterative process. We trial and we error and we learn from that and we adapt. And essentially, we got to a position where we still were able to achieve that CDA, but we're in a position which was more sustainable. And perhaps it might be a turn to ask Axel to come in here, because there was an attempt that we did where there was a real issue with breathing. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I think it's basically the difference between what we call an active and a passive position. Basically, an active position, you're pushing yourself into something to be more aerodynamic. So for me, we found that the sort of flat back performed very well in the wind tunnel. So we knew that that was going to be important to hold throughout the entire attempt. But we also knew that in this position, the only way to achieve the flat back was by actively pushing down into the shoulders. But unfortunately, this had the effect of basically 5 minutes was fine, 10 minutes was fine, but then sort of slowly those muscles started to strain, and obviously you had to fuel those muscles, and then eventually there was kind of a lack of oxygen, I would say, at which point I couldn't ride in any position anymore. I just had to get up onto the base bar, which was pretty catastrophic, especially at 52 k's an hour. But then I think we knew kind of from then on that we pushed it too far, and we knew that that was a really achievable CDA, hopefully at some point, but we knew we had to get a little bit smarter with it.
Yeah, so that was an absolute perfect example of the iterative aspects that we followed. And so that at that stage, we had to sort of go back and think, well, how can we still achieve based on modelling what we need to from an aerodynamics perspective, but how do we make it sustainable? And we went down the route of exploring crank length. And without sort of talking through too much about the detail, we managed to shorten it so it increased his hip angle. So it reduced some of the stresses on his sort of respiratory and diaphragm. And that we found didn't make a huge impact on his CDA, but it did make a big difference to how sustainable that position was for Axel. And we then looked at a few other things and whether that opened up aspects to do with the cockpit. And yeah, eventually, actually, I think we found a better CDA value through those changes than we did initially with a really, really tucked and unsustainable position. So, and that was just through teachings and learning and understanding how one aspect of performance is affected by another.
And Richard, how does the physiology link into all of this? If we've got the aerodynamics, playing around with the position on the bike, I assume then there's an element of training for that position, or ensuring, if you know what power output is required, how do you actually train to be able to generate that power? And is that where your role then fits in with this as well?
I mean, that boils down to the general training principles, that Paddy would be sort of implementing over the course of the, I don't know, when did you really start the intense training, or the whole block of training in the lead up, Axel? Was it sort of
probably a year before?
A year before, yeah, exactly.
Well, it must be, it would have been probably 11 months, because I guess I had an off season and then kind of.
Yeah, so the whole principle of setting macro cycles and micro cycles on a sort of periodized basis of base training, and then sort of more sort of intense training blocks and so on. That's the coach's role, which Paddy has a huge expertise in. That's underpinned by quite routine and quite well established training principles of periodization, training distribution profiles, and so on. So that was the long-term goal of Paddy. But I think in terms of the capacity to deliver power, so that's what it's all about. So Duncan squashed him into the box. Joshua's fine-tuned that, but it's having the capacity to deliver that power in that position, which I think Axel then trained in that position at appropriate points of time. But in terms of delivering the power, it's all around the ability to deliver sustainable power. And sustainable power is underpinned by many things, but it's one of the main components that we were working around was the so-called critical power concept. And as part of Axel's testing routines and testing periods, he would undergo regular testing to get his lactate thresholds, the first threshold, the critical power testing, and then the VO2 max. The VO2 max is just his engine, as he got a big engine, but the capability of delivering that engine is all around about critical power. And without getting into too much technicalities, critical power is about your maximal sustainable power that you can maintain for around about, well, it's thought to be around about an hour, but it's actually less than that. It's 20 to 30, maybe 40 minutes. If you are above that power, your time is limited. You will fatigue, and that's physiology. There's a production of fatigue causing, metabolites. You're using more anaerobic metabolism, and you will stop. So it's understanding that particular domain of exercise above critical power, and then training towards raising that critical power, which Paddy would implement in his training cycles, and then testing that to see if it improves. And then it all then boiled down to the pacing strategy on the day. So if we were to sort of suggest to Axel, you're going to have to sustain more than critical power, high levels of critical power for the hour, he wouldn't do it. And that's a physiological fact. So it was all about developing a pacing strategy for the event on the day. So that was, again, part of the iterative process that Axel worked with Paddy to see, what is going to be the pacing strategy during that particular event. And that's before we even start talking about, the other strategic, the other strategies around the effect of heat, because a velodrome is 25, 26 degrees, depending upon where you are. There's humidity. So, we have to tackle that phenomena as well. And we know for a fact that, in hot environments, performance is impaired. So there was an element of heat acclimation and heat acclimatization processes going on throughout the training cycle. So all, sort of packaged around coaching science, cycling physiology and science, but it then fits into that package that Duncan and Josh gave to us to work on.
It's interesting as well as to why we chose to do the record attempt in Grenchen in September, and that alludes to some of what Richard was saying there. The temperature is right at that time of year. It's warm enough to get the density down, but it's not too hot that the athlete is going to overheat. The Grenchen is at a little bit of altitude, so again, it's got enough altitude for density to be lower, so you go through the air quicker, but it's not so high in altitude such that the athlete has oxygen deprivation. So there was a lot of background thought about where we do this. Grenchen is now the de facto place where the last 3 world records were, I think the last 3 were actually broken. It's just that perfect combination of altitude and temperature, but we couldn't do it, for example, in July, because it would have been a sauna, and Axel would just not have coped, even though there was a lot of heat acclimatization, and Axel was training in the environmental suite where he was being exposed to high temperatures and high humidities. He just wouldn't have coped. So, there's a lot more than just Josh's physio, my aerodynamics, Paddy's coaching, Richard's physiology, bringing all that together, choice of venue, choice of time of year. So there's a big picture.
What did that heat acclimation process look like then? You mentioned environmental chambers. And what was that like? What exactly were you doing to prepare for that heat?
Well, Paddy was front and centre to that, but it's just a question of spending, sort of appropriate periods of time exercising in hot environments. So, where were you doing most of that, Axel?
It was mainly just like winter layers in the summer, but also where I lived in Germany, where my parents live in Germany, I was visiting for most of the summer. It's typically like 35 degrees during the day throughout the whole summer. So actually we didn't have to do that much heat adaptation. I just trained in the middle of the day and just got really, really hot. But as it was in September, I mean, a bit of a funny year where September was actually cold, whereas last year it was a little bit warmer, but this year it was actually cooler and raining. We kind of had to bring up a little bit of sauna in there as well to just create an acute response. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Fred?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are ways and means of doing this. You can do it naturally by being in a hot environment, and some athletes would go to places where it's nice, it's naturally warm, and you would just spend your time there, and the physiological adaptations would take place. If you don't have the budget for having sort of nice long summer camps in nice places, then you have to sort of budget in various ways. And whilst we do have facilities at Loughborough in terms of heat chambers and heat chamber facilities, getting access again is not always possible. So other ways is you can find ways of locking yourself into your own small room, sealing up the windows, and putting heaters on in the corner to get the temperature up. And you go so far as putting the kettles on and boiling water to create to create the sort of the humidity stress, which all adds to the stress of performing the exercise. But if you do it in advance as an acclimation process, you become used to those particular environments. So yeah, we probably had a mixed approach in doing whatever was available to us within a limited budget, which is fair enough to say. But we managed it. But it was all planned and strategized around good scientific principles that Paddy was implementing at the time.
I say, talking about one of those scientific principles, Richard sort of covered earlier around periodization, and I guess a real showcase of how that sort of unfolded, whether in that sort of physiological domain or sort of more in mine and bike fitting, is in the case of heat acclimation. There was actually a session, it feels like quite a long time ago, where we actually trained Axel in his position, his final position, which we ended up calling position D, as it was the fourth iteration, if you like, of the positions. And we actually exposed him whilst in that final position to aspects such as heat. So there was some specificity towards that back end of the preparations, which actually integrated in with other aspects. And so, yeah, it was real kind of discussing amongst the expertise and trying to utilize that and combine it. I mentioned earlier about how we sort of came together and it blossomed greater results. And that's through thinking of what I do and through thinking of what Richard was doing and Paddy and then the aerodynamic side of things with Duncan as well. So, yeah, a lot of it was just discussing really and expressing what we think would be the most important thing at that stage of preparation. And then it was a discussion as to how other facets of performance fitted into that.
I think the most kind of the overarching idea was that we're not going to reinvent the wheel on the physiology side, because these things work, and especially training for something like an hour is quite a predictable thing. But I think where we got a little bit clever with it is that, or I wouldn't say clever, I mean, it's very obvious, but a lot of people don't do it, is just training in position. I think a lot of people don't do it because it just sucks so much. Because you're basically on your TT bars riding like this, and you have a 0.95 effect to your power or something like that. So you're doing less power than you could be doing, right? But then, like, it's just that constant urge during those interval of just wanting to get off and onto the base bar and sitting up and doing as much power as you can do, and just having to fight that urge the whole time. And it's especially when Paddy and I did a lot of sessions where we were in the same room together, which I think these days is not super common in cycling training anymore.
And it's worth mentioning that wouldn't have been an option for us if it wasn't for the brilliant facility of the Cycling Performance Hub that we have here at the university.
Yeah, exactly. So we basically have access to a great hub, and we set up like a watt bike there, basically, that sort of models the position perfectly. And then essentially Paddy and I would just go in there and he would be doing kind of his PhD work or some other work. And because obviously it wouldn't be useful for him to stare at me for an hour and a half. But like sort of when things were getting spicy, or like, at the end of a 4-minute interval, he would be coming in and kind of yelling at me and things like that. But oftentimes it wouldn't be yelling at me to go harder. It would be yelling at me to slow down and just finish the session kind of for the day. And then be back tomorrow, because that's something as well I think we adopted. It's just the idea of consistency, just being like, you don't need to go 110% on one day if you're going to go 50% the next day because you're so tired. It's important to just get the right amount out of you every single day and just stick to the plan. So yeah, I think the most important thing we did really was just on the physiology side, I think, was just being super realistic with ourselves. Where are the numbers at? What's the point of training at 110% of, like, pretending like your critical power is 110% of what it actually is? Like, okay, it looks cool when you tell your mates on the group ride, But at the end of the day, that wasn't the goal, and it wouldn't make any, like, if anything, it would have a negative effect if you were training too hard the whole time. So it's just kind of like this concept of ego lifting in the gym. It's just like, stop the ego training. Who cares what numbers you hit in training? It's all about what numbers you're going to hit on the day. And more importantly than that is what speed you're going to hit. Because if you save 50 watts on aerodynamics, but then you do 20 watts less, just because of physiological limitations, then that's a big gain. It doesn't really... Nobody at the end of the attempt is going to take the Garmin and go, oh, look at that, you did this many watts, isn't that great? And oh, you didn't set the record, but yay, look how many watts you did. Like, no, nobody cares. It's all about doing the distance. And then if at the end of the day it took 10 watts less than we expected, then that will be a great success for everybody in the team.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And Paddy's mantra, as it is with many high class coaches, it's training smart. You got to train smart and not try and sort of push it too much. But that training was based upon rigorous physiological measurements of training domains and so on. So if Axel had a set power or a set intensity, he would ensure that he would stick to that. And sort of wind it in. If he's doing a road ride, for an hour or two, you come to a hill and you're feeling saucy because you're feeling fresh. You don't push it over the limit by too much. You rein it in so that training sort of stimulus is maintained as to what the target was for that particular session. And then when it's a hard session, it's an interval session that's been prescribed, again, based upon the training domains paradigm, then, you stick at those domains and you stick at that power and you don't try and push it further or anything like that, because, you're just causing, you're getting more tired than you should. And then you can't recover as well and you can't train effectively the next day. So it's all rigorous science. It's all integrated with the coach. Nothing groundbreaking. We haven't developed a new training philosophy or anything like that. It's all based upon good scientific principles, though.
If we did, we wouldn't tell you.
Yeah, true.
but what Richard says is really another good example of integration. So you've got to be able to maintain it for the hour. That's the bottom line. Because if you start to get tired, the athlete or Axel starts to sit up. Well, you've got Josh shouting position and things from the sideline, but if you're sitting up, very quickly that affects the aerodynamics. Very quickly you're going to create more drag, and it is very fine margins. So getting tired and not being able to put the power down, fatiguing, you start sitting up, you're on a slippery slope to losing. You're also, if you ever watch anyone ride the track, there's line efficiency is enormous as well. So Axel put a lot of effort into improving line efficiency and riding the black line. Just 1% or 0.5% in line efficiency loses you 250, 300 meters for the record. And that's the margin between making it and not. And if you're trying too hard, you're putting out too much power and you're wobbling all over the place. So there's that balance. It really was integrating the whole of the aspects of this. The aerodynamics was there. We didn't squash him too much. We got some really good aerodynamics. We've got the right bike, the right wheels, the right helmet, the right skin suit. Got his CDA down to something that was quite amazing, less than 0.18, which is pretty impressive because Axel's quite a tall cyclist with broad shoulders. But then on top of that, we had the training. Paddy put down that training regime. Axel stuck to it and developed that ability to maintain for an hour. Josh made sure that his discipline on the bike was spot on and had signals for him during the hour test to say if things were going wrong. We only had a couple of voices talking to Axel during the hour. Josh was one for positioning and Paddy was obviously the coach calling out times and things. But that whole package meant that Axel could do it for the hour and just the hour, and then get that record and get past the 51.1 kilometers. And like Axel says, who cares what power you did? It's getting past that. Who really, yes, people do care. They want to know what power you did, what CDA you were running, but it doesn't matter what they were if you've got 51.1 kilometers done, which we did, or which Axel did.
And this was all going on, throughout that year, through those macro and micro cycles that Richard alluded to. But then what was it like in the build up to the day itself? Was there anything particular that was being focused on, or anything that was kind of really a particular focus that you had to get right in the build up to the day itself?
I think things could have run a bit smoother, but I don't think
Pun intended.
we're going to get into that too much. There was just a little bit of a mix-up with commissaires, kind of a little bit out of our hands, a little bit of kind of maybe us thinking everything will be all right, and maybe not really getting involved enough in that, but just kind of being super focused and kind of obsessed with just the performance rather than the paperwork side of things.
So it just goes to show what being an elite athlete is like. Axel had to deal with pressures on the day because we had to move the attempt up an hour because of the commissionaire's availability. I didn't say anything on the day, but the weather didn't look brilliant. I think Axel realised that it wasn't quite as warm as it should have been. The pressure wasn't quite as low as we've liked. So, nothing's ever perfect. And I think that's something you've got to learn to deal with. And Axel did a really good job with that. So once we hit the big button to go on the day, everything fell into place. And Axel was very professional. And it was a really amazing thing to watch. Once it started, I had no input. I just watched it. I was nervous, biting my nails, but quite easily, soon it was quite evident that he was doing well and was going to make it. And I think with half an hour in, it was pretty clear that he was nailing it.
What about nutrition then in the build-up? Is there anything particular being focused on there?
Not really. I don't think we got because obviously you can't eat or drink during the race. So I think there was a kind of this idea of, we had some attempts sort of earlier in the year where I was just like slamming gels and drinking loads of water just before the start, and then just feeling so horrendous for literally the entire thing. And then just kind of realizing that if I can get in enough kind of natural stuff, natural, like gels are obviously not an imaginary thing, but in terms of just eating some couscous, eating the right sort of carbohydrates in the morning, you don't actually need to get that intelligent with the nutrition afterwards. You just kind of, I don't really know all the science behind it, but I was advised that we're just gonna eat and then not take any gels 2 minutes beforehand, just to not spike anything, because I think we've had that problem before where it's just tipping into hypoglycemia. Is that right, Rich?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there would have been a sort of planned, as Axel said, to have, a good carbohydrate-rich pre-meal and so on, which is what he would do anyway. He'd been preparing for this anyway, so it's whatever his natural pre-race dietary preparation would have been. He's not riding a 6-hour Grand Tour race. So we're not going to be limited in terms of, carbohydrate depletion and glycogen depletion and having to take on board fluids and so on during the event, because he can't do that. So it was just, making sure his tanks, his glycogen stores are as full as possible before the event, which is just done through, good dietary management. And then, doing whatever's appropriate so that he wasn't affected in his stomach and so on in that immediate sort of pre-race preparation. I can't recall whether there was any supplementation. There was bicarb,
yeah.
or
there was sodium bicarb. Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning that you sort of, it becomes so natural. You just went through a process, I guess, beforehand. But yes, you did have sodium bicarb.
Yeah, he can't even remember what he was doing. So we used sodium bicarbonate as a pre-race supplement, which again, it's not rocket science. It's well established in the sense that you supplement with this solution, and it's a hydrogen buffer. So it buffers the hydrogen ions that are produced during intense exercise, and that's produced when you're metabolizing anaerobically. So a big anaerobic input to the energy delivery. But those hydrogen ions can contribute to the fatigue process. So they slow the muscle down and reduce the power. So if you can buffer those to a certain extent and sort of get rid of them as they appear, you have the potential for improving power and improving performance. So it's well established. But the thing with bicarbonate is it can affect the stomach. You can be sick with it. You have a dose of bicarbonate drink, and an hour later you're throwing your guts up. So you have to prepare for that in advance of the effort. Some athletes can cope with it, others can't. So over the course of the preceding few months, again working with Paddy, we worked on the optimal dose, the optimal time to take it before the effort, and then as was alluded to, Axel's pretty much forgotten he was doing that because that became part of the sort of process. Absolutely. So we bicarbonate supplemented, and that might have contributed. We can't quantify it, but it might have contributed 1, 2, 3% to his overall performance, which is a lot. But it's again, winding it back to Duncan, line efficiency also contributes 1% to the performance. So it was a fully integrated approach where we try and find these small percentiles that will enhance the possibility that Axel will break the record, and he did.
I think to add on to that though, it was very much, we combined everything together, but we also were very realistic sort of with the hard science of like, if the CDA is this, then you will need to do this much power. And for a lot of those worse or slower CDA values, that created or equated a power that was impossible to achieve for me. And we sort of very quickly realized that there is a drop off in power when you get to the track. And I don't think anybody here knows exactly why that actually happens. I think it could be a mental thing. I think it could be the fact that there's no rests. It could be the fact that like it's just a constant pedal and that the position is so compact that you're using tiny little muscles that you didn't even know you had. But one thing that we did know is that if the CDA was not this, then the record would be impossible. So I think that kind of hard limit of we need to get the CDA and then the body will adapt was kind of as well kind of an important thing that we thought about. And like to an extent we sort of helped the body adapt by kind of changing the positions and I mean we spoke about that earlier, just to how can we then hit that CDA in a different creative way that means it doesn't have or doesn't create the same limitations physiologically.
Axel spent a lot of time in the first few months of this year in the bike hub, in the cycling hub, on that walk bike that he mentioned, training in that position. So he's already alluded to the fact that a lot of people go and train but sit up a little bit and relax a little bit. Axel was very disciplined training that position. So although the aerodynamic position when we got his CDA down to below 0.18 was intense and difficult, he put the effort in to be able to maintain it. So he knew full well that if we could hit that CDA with the power that he can put out in the track, as we started to get an idea of what that was compared to his testing or his road ability, knew full well it was all possible then. So knowing the numbers, I mean I'm an engineer, so it was nice to model it, and we knew it was possible, but it wouldn't have come without Axel's effort in training it as well.
I think maybe Duncan, you could just add a little bit of, because obviously we went to the wind tunnel lots. What was kind of the main things that we kept in mind methodology wise and things like that when it came to aero testing?
Yeah, I can explain the process. So actually at the start when Axel was winning books a couple of years ago, his aerodynamic position was not good. He was just a raw power machine for 4 or 5 minutes. So we knew that we could get his aerodynamics down quite quickly in the wind tunnel. So in the wind tunnel, Axel's on the bike pedaling in a realistic position, and we're using the wind tunnel to measure that drag. So for those who aren't aware, probably 90-95% of what you're overcoming when you're cycling around a velodrome is aerodynamic drag. So that's the power is going into overcoming that aerodynamic drag. So key to reducing the drag is using, if you imagine the track cyclist with the hands on the extension bars, is using those hands and arms to direct the flow around the torso. It's not just about squashing someone into a box like we alluded to earlier on. It's about streamlining and directing the flow. So I knew what would and wouldn't work, but it's not one size fits all. So we had Axel in, and we very quickly got some good gains with arm positions and back positions, like Axel said earlier, and getting into that position. We tested a number of different wheels as well. We were very lucky that Axel already had a very good bike, and we didn't have the budget to change that, but we did change the wheels. And one of the key things actually for Axel was the helmet he used. He's quite a broad-shouldered athlete, so we used a POC Tempo helmet, which actually streamlined the flow around Axel's shoulders quite nicely. So that was the process in the wind tunnel, and we did that a number of times, going back and tweaking things. And in between that, we would go to the velodrome to see whether we could actually reproduce that CDA that we've measured, because the wind tunnel is not real. Axel is pedaling, but he's only pedaling for 30 seconds at a time when we measure it. So going to the velodrome and starting to do some longer tests and actually seeing whether we can replicate that. And that's where we really discovered that line efficiency was key as well, and training on that and making sure he wasn't riding further every lap that he needs to do, riding on that black line. And what we found was that we could replicate the CDA, the drag, in the velodrome that we're measuring in the wind tunnel. And we just kept tweaking. We tweaked too far at one point, and said before, with the position became very aggressive but unsustainable. And that was where we had the experience of Josh come in and say, no, you've got to back off a bit, and we'll work at that. And we got back towards that. And we had this goal of getting his CDA down to lower than 0.18, which for someone of Axel's height is extremely low. And the final thing we did with Axel was we got him a bespoke skin suit from a company called Vortec, who are also based down at Silverstone, where the wind tunnel is. And that gave him a little bit extra benefit as well. The flow around the cyclist's body is very much dictated by the fabric and the roughness of the fabric and where that is on the suit. So we got a suit made for him. We got several suits made for him because we had to test several, because we were looking for the best suits. We'd already got a very good aerodynamic position from him, and actually Vortex struggled to get anything better, but they did. So that whole package ultimately gave him a CDA of, I think, somewhere in the region of 0.178. So very low for someone who is as tall as Axel with broad shoulders. And then we knew that with the power he could put out, what he was seeing in the lab, what he was doing on the track, that everything was there.
You mentioned earlier, Axel, some of your feelings as you were about to start the attempt itself. What's your main memory of the event itself, what you were feeling and thinking as it was going on?
I think the record was, first of all, I'd like to say that the final hour I did, the one that actually broke it, was probably the quickest hour I ever did. So, like, obviously, all hours are the same length, but they obviously do not feel like that when you're suffering like a pig. An hour can feel a lot more like a day. And I think we had a lot of experiences of that. Whereas I think everything came together so well on that day that just suddenly I was 40 minutes through and I was feeling all right. And I was ahead of schedule, I think 600 meters up on schedule, something like that. At which point, unfortunately, I had a little bit of stomach play up to the point where I couldn't really push on sort of as the plan had kind of anticipated. I think that I'm mainly kind of an individual pursuit build where I'm really like physiologically I'm optimized sort of for something that's 3 to 5 minutes long, not really an hour. And I really struggle in that. I think we've really learned that by doing the hour record for a year. But what we kind of wanted to do is just like unleash that sort of over the last 10 minutes and just really like knock the record out of the park. But unfortunately, that didn't really come into fruition. But luckily, we were already kind of so far ahead of the record that I was able to just sort of ride it in. But I was still like suffering. But I just couldn't really push it just with that sort of risk of, well, I don't want to get too disgusting on the podcast, but like I just didn't want to, throw up on the track basically and have the record cancelled, which would have been absolutely catastrophic. And it's just kind of the idea of like, we set out a year ago to set this record. And if you told me a year ago that I would beat the record by 640 odd meters, I'd be over the moon. And it's very easy now to be like, oh, but I wish I had beaten it by a kilometer. I wish I'd beaten it by 2 kilometers and things like that. It's just that feature creep of just like constantly edging your goal on as you start to improve towards it. But it actually allowed me kind of 5 minutes of reflection as I was finishing. And I just like had this feeling of just happiness and kind of just achievement almost of just, wow, like it's done. And it's just felt like it would never finish, because there were times when in April when we were like, okay, we've got 5 more months of training. How you feeling? Everything's going well. It's like, oh my gosh, we have 5 more months of training. And then suddenly you're in your last 5 minutes of doing the actual record, and you're just about to cross the finish line. And yeah, I think in general, it's just a very positive experience the whole hour, that actual day. And then just being able to have most of the people there in person as well in Grenchen, and just being able to celebrate afterwards, and like getting the little red board with the distance on it and my name and the flowers and stuff like that. And like all of that was just really great. And yeah, obviously super thankful to the team and for all of their efforts and everything like that. It was genuinely just like the biggest team effort ever, because sometimes like professional cyclists will like go and win a tour stage and they did it all on their own, and then they'll be like, oh, I'm very thankful to the team. And you're kind of like, well, you did that all on your own. But looking back here, I know for certain that without every single person who played a role, that I would have never gotten close. So as Josh said, we really came together and formed a group that was greater than the sum of all of its parts. And I think we all just really nailed it every day and on the day.
And I think a really nice kind of position to be in now as well to continue this on is that I believe you're starting to study for your own PhD in an area related to this as well, aren't you now, Axel?
Yeah, so I started a month ago-ish with my supervisor, who is also at the virtual table, Duncan, in surface roughness and material selection for cycling aerodynamics, which is incredibly interesting. And kind of throughout my undergrad, I always kind of picked topics that sort of related to aerodynamics, because I really enjoyed that, and also cycling, because obviously I really enjoyed that. So kind of being able to bring in the undergrad, which, contrary to popular belief, you can actually enjoy engineering undergrad, at least parts of it. So picking kind of the best times I had in my undergrad and the best parts of my hobby and just sticking them together, and now actually doing that full time is just a really cool experience, and I'm really looking forward to the next 3 years.
It's great to hear you say after the hour attempt as well that you still really enjoy cycling. It hasn't completely changed your perspective on that.
Well, if you asked me 2 weeks ago, my answer might have been a bit different, but or 3 weeks ago. I think being a really good athlete means when you need to rest, and it means when you need to just chill out, because physically you can do something, but if mentally you're not there, it's never going to happen, and vice versa. If you're mentally really keen for something but physically you're not there, you're never going to achieve it either. So you just kind of need to rest all the parts. And I think after the hour I was not there mentally or physically, so just kind of took a whole month off training, and then just slowly started actually getting excited again to ride a bike. But unfortunately the early kind of off season means that now I am starting training in kind of the end of October, and now November, December means I get all of the cold weather, whereas some people who start their off season in November don't get all of the cold, because they get to miss like 2 weeks in November, but I get all of it. So hopefully I will become not a fair weather cyclist anymore like I was last year, where I just got to go on the track whenever it was raining.
And what's next for the wider group and cycling at Loughborough in general?
Yeah, though I do want to take this one as well, because I just want to make it so clear that at the university, kind of our superpower is that we have an amazing facility and an amazing team at Loughborough Sport, but we also have an amazing team on the academic side through the sports and exercise science, but also all of the engineering hubs. And I think that this is the first project, but definitely not the last project, where we definitely nailed and brought together everything, including the engineering side, especially for the sports stuff. And I think that it's important to remember that I'm not particularly special. I was just a student at Loughborough University. I only really started my cycling journey here. I'd only been cycling a year when I started here. So I think it's just important to know that if you have an ambitious goal and you have kind of a plan and you believe in it, and you come to university here, you could make that happen basically with the right team. And I think we're all keen to do the next project as well.
What we'd like this to become, and what we did this for, is, well, first of all, we've proven now that we can do this. We've got a group of people who can come together, and Axel's now part of that group going forward as well. He's not just the athlete; he's going to be part of the team, helping other athletes. And we'd like to be able to offer that kind of experience to other up and coming athletes, whether it's people who are fairly new to the sport or people who are looking to be elite level. And getting involved with those athletes from a coaching perspective, from an aerodynamics perspective, physiology, and really pushing the boundaries of performance and understanding. And that's really where Axel's PhD comes in. We know how it works aerodynamically. We know how it works. We understand it. We understand boundary layer transition and separation, all the fundamental aspects. But it's so much of a individual thing that we need still to improve our understanding, and that's just from my area, the aerodynamics bit, and it's the same across all the rest of cycling. So we want to push the knowledge boundaries. We want to make sure that feeds back into what Loughborough does in sport as well, and supporting the cycling team and the triathlon team, and anybody else who wants to come and work with us. We're open to work with anybody in this arena because we all have a passion for it.
I think it just highlights the whole Loughborough ecosystem of integration between academics across all disciplines. I mean, this is one very sport performance specific example, but there are other examples across health, well-being, and the other sort of key sort of world issues of net zero and climate change and so on. We have the whole ecosystem that cycling transcends the whole university in many respects. So we've got the support services through Loughborough Sport and that system of facilities, the gyms, the laboratories and so on. So this is just one example of what we can do, and we have a passion for doing, of integrating academic expertise with sports and coaching and so on. So it's really, as Duncan said, we're open for business. We're wanting to collaborate with users and teams and so on to really answer the questions that they have to have an impact on their performance. And we've got the expertise across all disciplines, not just in aerodynamics and physiology, nutrition, biomechanics. You're a biomechanist, Stuart. You should be involved in cycling science. So that's the opportunity that we've got, and we can really use this to promote that.
So if anyone listening does want to find out more, either about any of that or kind of some of the topics we've spoken about around physiology, aerodynamics, etc., what would you recommend, or what's the best way of people either getting in touch or finding out a bit more?
Well, this all kicked off really over a cup of coffee, right at the start of Paddy and Axel having a coffee, and me and Paddy having a coffee and talking about it. So if anyone wants to know about aerodynamics, drop me an email. I'll have a coffee with you and tell you about it and see where it goes from there.
Yeah, it's exactly that. We're having a quick conversation first on the phone, then we would bring you onto campus and have a chat and show you the ecosystem, show you the facilities. And we just chat, and as well as emailing Duncan, email myself, and both of us, including Josh, we can be the conduit to other colleagues across campus. So whether it's in sports performance, health and well-being, or whatever, we can direct you to appropriate colleagues, and come for a coffee. and we'll even pay for it.
Well, there's an offer you can't refuse. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I really, really appreciate your time. I just want to end with another massive congratulations on a really impressive record.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.